a lot of companies have retained their office estate and just wanted to see how the market's going. Others have got rid of it, and therefore there's probably a bit more supply back into the office market. Agents tend to like working with me and working with us. We talk their language. We know our way around a lease. We know our way around a deal, and it becomes a more simplified transaction. But ultimately, I'm there to do the best service and the best job I can for my clients. So that's getting the best lease, getting the best incentives, and just making sure that they are protected from some of the things that they get caught out by normally.
Welcome to the Business Sense podcast. I'm Garry Crosby. This is the podcast where we make sense of the business journey by talking to owners about what they've learnt along the way. Let's jump into today's episode. Jonathan, thanks for joining us on the Business Sense podcast this morning.
Pleasure.
Looking forward to this. Obviously, you are the lease negotiator, but give me a little bit of context. What is your business? What do you do?
Fundamentally, it's to help business owners grow their businesses. And one of the challenges that business owners face when trying to scale or grow is the property issue. And that is either through trying to find a property to expand into or simply negotiation. And as the lease negotiator, we help business owners, directors, founders through that property journey by taking sort of the property issues and helping them through that process.
What do you think is the biggest challenge that they face then? Is it a knowledge thing? Is it time? What do they need?
It's exactly those two points. First is time. Often sort of business owners are so busy and heavily entrenched in running the business that they just simply haven't got the spare time to go and find a solution. And passing it down to a junior member of staff, again, isn't necessarily the right answer. So what you often find is sort of business owners will try and do it at weekends or when they get a spare moment. And when you come to try and find property, it needs to be consistent in terms of just, it's difficult to find often. Often the properties are in short supply, and trying to do it ad hoc just doesn't work. And then secondly, in terms of the knowledge, I think a lot of business owners will think that negotiation skills are general, whereas I think just through my own experience, property is very, very specific. It's quite technical. And if you haven't got that skill set, again, you don't know what you don't know. And the conversations I've had with business owners over the years in terms of, we made that mistake, or we fell into that trap, or we didn't realise, as the lease negotiator, we just help to prevent those kind of issues arising by getting it right at the start.
And I do want to talk about the customer journey, because I think that whole journey from, finding the property to occupying it to using it, maybe then getting to the end where you're moving on to another property and you have to end the lease and things. But we'll definitely talk about that. But I was looking at the residential property market recently, and of course that's down from its highs in sort of August 2022. We're seeing property prices dropping off. What's happening in the commercial property market generally?
It continues to be, I think, a fairly mixed bag. Obviously, the commercial property is a very wide spectrum. So you've got retail, you've got industrial, you've got life science and sort of the biotech and labs sector. Industrial, and then offices. And I think it's very difficult to pin it down into sort of one scenario, because you've got very different locations, you've got very different sectors. I think that generically or generally, I think the industrial sector has performed incredibly well from a landlord's position. There's been a lack of supply. There's been quite a lot of demand from businesses who are moving and expanding within that sector. So that's been a very buoyant market. Offices are very much in transition. I think we've heard a lot of commentators saying that obviously there was an immediate reaction COVID-wise in terms of having to get people working from home very, very quickly. At that point, businesses had to react. And many did so very successfully. And then there's been a very difficult position with now between obviously employees that are going, well, we can actually work from home. Why do we need to come into the office? And the employers going, well, actually, we want you back. So I think in terms of offices have been very mixed in terms of a lot of companies have have retained their office estate
Mm-hmm.
and just wanted to see how the market's going. Others have got rid of it, and therefore there's probably a bit more supply back into the office market. But we're now starting to see almost a shift where people, I think Google have made an announcement recently that they want everybody back in the office at least 3 days a week.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting sector. And then retail, and I think it's been very well publicised in terms of the almost death on the high street, and the problems that retail is facing in terms of attracting customers back into the shops.
Yeah.
The government have made, obviously one of the planning situations is they've made it easier for sort of use classes, so different properties to change the use. So obviously that's helped just revitalise things a bit. But the retail sector's probably still quite tough.
And retail being changed into residential even in some cases.
Yeah, residential. There's even talk. Obviously, one of the sectors that does seem to be booming at the moment is this life science and biotech. So there's even talk of shopping centres being converted into huge laboratories.
Wow.
Which obviously is a complete change in direction. But and it's great that those type of buildings and type of things can be repurposed.
And you've done a lot of work, I know, in the biotech sector. That must be particularly demanding in terms of, the technical aspects of the building.
Very much so, and it is there seems to be a huge amount of investment going into that sector at the moment.
Yeah.
We've done some very interesting work and had some really great. It's great to talk to these businesses in terms of their journey, what they're up to, and really innovative. And it's great to be involved in it.
And I guess very specific requirements for power supplies and ventilation, and not allowing viruses to escape, and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in terms of, again, the spectrum from I'm working with one company at the moment that just need a manufacturing facility. They've got this particular product that they sell out into the pharma industry, and they just need somewhere to manufacture that facility. So it's a bit more than a basic industrial unit, right through to the very clean rooms that's sort of very high spec.
And one of the things that it feels to me like, watching and listening to what you've been doing, that there is a power dynamic in the commercial property market. You've got landlords, you've got agents, you've got tenants.
Yeah.
Just talk me through that in terms of the relationship between those three.
Yeah, I suppose this has been a really interesting conundrum that I've been trying to solve from a business perspective. We'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but I think a lot of business owners don't necessarily realise sort of the very close relationship between the landlords and the property agents. And when you go to a property agent, you're expecting them to be able to help you find a property, when in reality what they're doing is they're acting for landlords. And that landlord-agent relationship is incredibly close. And as a business owner, you're almost on the outside of that, and that's to some extent what the lease negotiator's been trying to solve and to help, I suppose, balance that dynamic.
So you're operating on the side of the tenant, not in battle with the agent and the landlord, but looking to find a good solution for all sides.
I think in terms of, again, my conversations with agents tend to like working with me and working with us because we talk their language. We know our way around a lease. We know our way around a deal, and it becomes a more simplified transaction. But ultimately, I'm there to do the best service and the best job I can for my clients. So that's getting the best lease, getting the best incentives, and just making sure that they are protected from some of the things that they get caught out by normally.
So let's think about that customer journey then, because clearly, as you said at the beginning, that there's an enormous amount of complexity in it.
Yes.
But the first thing, I guess, if I was running a company and I'm thinking about, right, now's the time for me to start thinking about upgrading my property, for example, or moving into my first unit or whatever, there's the property finding conundrum. What's the best way for me as the business owner through that?
I suppose the quick answer is to appoint somebody like us to help you through that process. If you're doing it yourself, then the journey is normally through searching on websites.
Yep.
So there's various, and this is probably the complexity. In the residential market, it's largely dominated by Rightmove, but in the commercial market, there's very Rightmove have got a presence, but there's probably 3 or 4 other websites as well that are all competing.
Yeah.
So part of the challenge from the business owner's perspective, I suppose, is knowing where to look. And even some agents won't necessarily advertise on those platforms. So whereas in probably the residential market, you can just go to Rightmove and probably get 95% of the market. Yeah. In the commercial market, it's a bit more complex in terms of having to find those sites. But it would be contacting the agents that operate locally. So first of all is understanding who are the main agents marketing properties in that local arena. And that in itself is a challenge, because whilst you've got some local regional agents, national operators or national agents will often come in from time to time. So it is quite widespread in terms of trying to find that building.
And I don't know this, but so it's a question really. Are there commercial properties that change hands without ever coming to the market?
Yes, and again, I think if you know who's moving locally, you might have a conversation with those companies, and again, I suppose it comes back down to contacts. So who knows in terms of when those situations occur, and having a conversation with them. Might be bank managers, it might be accountants, and agents. So I think ultimately, it does come back down to how strong that relationship with an agent, because the agents will often go out to properties to view them and to list them. So often the agent will have seen and know about a property coming onto the market probably several weeks, even months before it actually does. And if you've got a close relationship with an agent, sometimes those agents will say, "Oh, I know you've got a client X who's looking for this. We've just been out to have a look at this building." And for the agent, that's a very, very easy deal.
And for the business owner, that would be completely invisible.
Correct,
As you said at the beginning, appointing someone like you helps that.
Yeah, and the amount of conversations I've had over the years about business owners who come to me and say, "We've missed out on that property, we may be putting an offer forward, or we weren't even aware that it came to the market and it's gone."
Yes.
So unfortunately, and this is not all agents, but some agents have their favourite people that they deal with. And at that point of view, it becomes, I suppose, a bit of a closed shop, isn't it? And how do you get involved, and how do you find out those kind of situations?
Yes. How could you? Because it's an invisible environment. But let's say you do. Let's say I've now found the property that I want, and I'm now into that power dynamic between me and the agent and the landlord, and I've got to negotiate. Let's just talk through, I guess, the common pitfalls for me as a business owner at that stage of the process.
It's interesting, because I think it's really important to understand when you get to find a building that is suitable. Some of those emotions then start to come out, because some business owners and businesses may be looking for years to try and find the building, and if they then find something that fits, it's very hard not to show that through your expressions or what you say. And the challenge behind that is, as soon as you do that, the agents are representing the landlords. And at that point, it becomes information that maybe you shouldn't have said, or a reaction that you shouldn't have
this is perfect for me.
Absolutely. And
it's the best building I've ever seen.
I've had, because I used to be a property agent, so I've kind of worked on that side of the fence as well. And many business owners, you kind of get them to the viewing, and they've said, "Oh yeah, we've just won a contract. We've not been able to find a building." And at that point, it's music to an agent's ears, because they've almost got them boxed into a corner in terms of the deal. And fundamentally, they are there to do the best deal they can for their landlord client.
So if I appointed the lease negotiator, then I wouldn't be there face to face, displaying those emotions. You'd be my agent, for want of a better word.
Absolutely. So, and we know what to say, what not to say. because there's a very, very fine line between making the agent aware that you're interested and making them aware that you are a sensible tenant, and then obviously giving too much away.
Yes.
Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I've had business owners that have come into buildings as well that have completely dismissed it and everything's rubbish about the building, and then made an offer. And again, that in itself goes, well, they're interested because they've just
of course.
So it's the negotiations, as you know, are probably it's an art form, and being skilled in that helps to get you the best deal.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier on the idea of incentives, which I'm again from a position of ignorance, I'm not really sure what that means. But from your perspective, acting as an agent for the tenant, what kind of incentives are we talking about? What can happen at that stage?
So this is all about understanding what do landlords generally want to get out of the transaction, and once you understand that then enables you to tweak the deal and to work the deal and give the landlord what they're after, but without necessarily negating what you're doing for your client and the business owner. But one way of doing that in terms is maximising the incentives. So it's things like landlords are really concerned about what we call covenant strength. So this is the strength of the tenant. And I deal with businesses from startups through to £100 million turnover businesses. And if either of those spectrums go to a landlord, they will get very, very different deals.
Yeah, of course.
Because the landlord is after the security of a tenant being able to pay the rent on time and knowing that they will hopefully be there for the full term of the lease.
Sure.
So covenant strength is one. Length of lease is also really important. Break clauses are out there. Repairing liability, and the way I sort of generally phrase this is, you've got different levers and different mechanisms of a lease, and depending on which lever and mechanism you pull depends on what incentives you can get out of it. So, and incentives are typically rent-free periods. So that's a period of time where you don't pay rent generally at the start of a lease, but it can happen through the lease. Reduce rent. So there's often a way to negotiate a cheaper deal, maybe in the first few years, or even reduce the asking rent entirely over the term of the lease, or up until the first rent review. And sometimes there are landlords' contributions to fit out works. So if often the tenant will have to go in and spend some money fitting out to their requirements. Sometimes the landlords will contribute to that fit out.
And just thinking back over the time the lease negotiator has been in business, can you give me an example of where you've stepped in on behalf of a tenant and secured some strong incentives?
Yeah, so it was a transaction that I was involved in a few years ago. There was it was a lease assignment, and basically there was 5 years left to run on the lease. I think we're in competition from what the agent said. There was other people interested in the building, but we've managed to, as part of the lease deal, we negotiated £600,000 worth of savings for that particular client.
Wow!
So obviously it was a large building, but that enabled them to really progress and spend money in terms of helping them move. Or obviously not all deals are like that, but that's a pretty good example in terms of where we're able to get a reverse premium from the client, from the outgoing tenant, and that helped massively with the costs of the client moving. And
I'm imagining a business owner with very little time and not quite enough knowledge, trying to struggle through that process and not being able to secure that kind of deal in the end.
Yeah, and I think. And the interesting thing about that particular client is they'd been searching for a while, not been able to find it, and then found the building. So it comes back down to that earlier conversation in terms of not knowing how hard to push to get the best deal, and not wanting to lose the building. Because often that's the key criteria, is if you find something that is suitable and it allows your business to expand, then often you don't want to lose the building, and therefore you may... leave money on the table, I suppose.
And so the lease negotiator, I guess, isn't just about that initial period. There's going to be times when people are renewing leases or trying to end leases or that kind of thing. What else
Certainly.
do you see in the market?
Yeah, so we offer the full service where somebody can come in and we can kind of take them from start to the finish. We have occasions as well where people have already identified the building and then just simply want us to do the negotiation. That's great. That's fantastic, and delighted to get involved with those. We also get to the point where clients have actually negotiated the deal, so they've negotiated a letting, and then they want us to go through it with a sort of fine tooth comb and sanction and see if there's anything else we can do.
Right.
Happy to do that, but it's almost a bit too late.
Feels a bit late, yeah.
Because obviously at that point, the landlord, the business owner's already agreed in principle or agreed in draft form what they're prepared to accept, and therefore taking a step back becomes a bit tricky. But again, we are able to do it, and in those circumstances, we have still been able to negotiate further incentives. But sometimes it can cloud the relationship between landlord and tenant if it's gone too far advanced. And then the sort of the final bit is, like I say, lease exit. So we've got a situation at the moment where a tenant is in the building. They're relocating to another site, and they've asked us if we can help through at least surrender and negotiate an exit with the landlord to allow them to release that building and then to take on the new site.
So it's full sort of cradle to grave type service, effectively.
It is, yes.
And I guess people sometimes get caught when they move out when the landlord says, you need to put this building back to how it was or something like that. Have you got any stories about dilapidations and repairs?
I think yes, I think certainly I think the biggest argument generally at the end of the lease is around dilapidations and how tenants are expected to leave the building. And it is relatively easy if you know at the start there are ways that you can mitigate your liability. But if you don't do that at the start, it can be very, very costly on exit. And that's one of the reasons that I think you should always take professional advice around somebody like a lease negotiator or somebody similar to make sure that you are protected, because having and what surprises me time and time again is the business owners that go, it'll be okay. I'm working with one company at the moment, and as part of their sort of relocation, I've spoken to them and said, look, as part of this process, you really need to understand what your exit figures are, because that could be quite a big number. And if that comes once you've signed the lease, you're then caught in a position that's very untenable almost in terms of that cost. So to be aware is to be forearmed, isn't it? And if you're aware of what those figures are in terms of what it's likely to cost you, it just makes for a much better informed decision. And whilst we're not building surveyors, we can certainly point people in the right direction to get that advice. And often the landlords, I've got one at the moment where the landlord is suggesting a dilapidations figure, and the tenants have done their own survey, and it's a third of the cost. So landlords will look to try and take advantage is the wrong word, but will look to maximise their returns out of the dilapidations, where often there can be a fight, I suppose.
And I imagine at the beginning, when you're excited about a new building and excited about expanding your company, something that's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time is probably off your radar.
Absolutely. I'll worry about that in time. I might not be even in the business at that point is one of the comments that, so they'll leave the problem for somebody else to deal with. But often it's what can be a very significant problem.
And I want to talk more generally about the business, Jonathan, because there's something that you've done recently that I've not seen a lot of people do, but I know that it does happen, and that is a rebranding exercise for the lease negotiators. So let's start with the motivation of that. What was it that motivated you to rebrand?
I think it was when I first set up in business. I suppose I was quite. I was very keen to represent the small business owner, and to protect their interests. And one of the challenges around that is small business owners sometimes don't necessarily have the money or the wherewithal or the um, or the situation is they don't necessarily want to employ somebody else to do it. That they think they can do it themselves. So over the past few years, the lease negotiator has been dealing with larger and larger and larger clients. But I think having relooked at the website, it's still represented a sort of relatively smaller business.
Yeah.
So it's almost the lease negotiator becoming a bit more grown up, I suppose, and taking a fresh look at things, trying to look at a different audience in terms of the scale of businesses that we're now dealing with, and just making sure that the website reflected, I suppose, who we are now.
And I imagine that there might be a lot of business owners who've been in the business 3 or 4 years, and they're thinking exactly the same. That the brand that we started with, that was maybe something we created ourselves, doesn't look quite the way we'd like it to. What are the sort of challenges that you face then when you actually trigger that idea of rebranding?
It's all around trying to hit the right target market. We worked with a company called Grey Coffee, and they went through a process, what they call clarity, which really is going back down to your basics of who you are, what you're trying to achieve, your purpose, your target market. And from that then gives you a really good platform and foundation to then look at, okay, what do we need to do? How do we need to communicate? What's colours in terms of communication? So I think part of the challenge is without that, you kind of, as with all these things, getting an expert on board to help you through that process was what we felt we had to do. And it comes back down to communication, just making sure that you are communicating. And I think the other significant challenge for me is we deal with such a wide-ranging market. So as I said, we deal with startups right through to almost multinational businesses, and through the different sectors. So we deal with offices, we deal with warehousing and distribution, we deal with retail, we deal with leisure, and we deal with sites. So, and the thing about marketing is they always say communicate to one individual. And across those different industries and sectors, it's quite hard to, because they all want different things. But I think fundamentally, what we all brought it back down to is trying to communicate with the business owner that goes, I've got a problem. I need to expand the business. I haven't got the time. I'm in a position where I haven't necessarily got the knowledge. Can we find somebody to bring in to do that for us? So it becomes I suppose it's coming back down to that individual, and it doesn't necessarily mean that individual doesn't necessarily sit in different types of sector or industry or even size of business, I suppose.
So they're broadly all, as we said at the beginning, short of time, short of knowledge. They want to get focused on growing the business. And this very complex environment and problem that sits out there, which is property scaling up, is best left to someone else.
And I think just thinking about it as well, not being able to find the building often is a very, very significant barrier to being able to grow a business. I suppose it comes back down to people and human resources, isn't it? If you can't find the people, your business won't grow. And I would like to try and put property into that same arena, because if you've not got the property to be able to grow your business, it stays stagnant or goes backwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about the rebranding and the way that you're now going to go out and face the market, what do you hope that the rebranding achieves? What would success look like?
I think certainly I think it's part of the issue that we face as a business is that the service that we offer isn't particularly well known. So one of the challenges that we've always faced is if a business owner's sitting in their office or in their industrial unit or factory or whatever, and they've got this property issue, where do they go and find a solution? The natural reaction and the well-trodden route is through the commercial property agent who are marketing the buildings. But as we've spoken before or spoken earlier, that necessarily doesn't produce the best and most efficient result. So part of our challenge is almost like a re-education of the market to say, if we can attract the business owners and even make them more aware that this is a solution and this is an opportunity that is available, and I think that would be the success, is to start to drive more conversations with business owners, just to make them aware that this service does exist.
So higher visibility and high awareness.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I guess timing is a thing, because you could talk to many people, you could reach out through the medium of the website and social media and things like that to people who probably could use the service, but it might not be for another 4 or 5 years' time.
Absolutely.
That must be a real challenge.
It is.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's the thing about commercial property, isn't it? And you've raised a really good point there, because it's something that is often infrequently done by business owners. So it's not something that they do every single week, and therefore this is where they get the gaps in the knowledge. Because they just, if you're dealing with negotiation every single day or every single week, it becomes second nature to you. Whereas if you've only done it once or twice in your business career,
it's new every time.
It's new, and also the market changes significantly over that period of time, isn't it? So you might have done it 5 or 10 years ago, but the market's changed significantly in that period.
And that's a perfect segue into my final question, Jonathan, which is looking at the market and thinking what's coming ahead. We've seen technology impacting in lots of different markets. We've seen trends and changes in legislation around use and things like that. What can you see coming down the line for commercial property?
I think obviously the regulations are becoming a lot tighter in terms of energy efficiency. And certainly in terms of a lot of the industrial stock in particular is significantly old. So I think there will be some changes around that sector, because at some point landlords and probably what they'll try to do is make the tenants more responsible for bringing these buildings up into an efficient state.
Yes.
But if units cannot be let because they're not efficient enough, then that will take out, again, a huge amount of stock in the market, and that will just put a bigger pressure on those buildings that are available. I think the retail sector has gone through a real period of change and will continue to do so. I think smaller independent retailers are. I've just been acting for an optician that have just opened up their first store, and I think it's really interesting looking into the shopping centres, because they've had to re-engineer and rechange, and there's been some real challenges in terms of how do they make it more attractive to get into the centre and to use their. And I think that will continue. And the offices, because again, there's been a shift away and a move away from offices, but we're now saying a real fight for companies wanting to try and get their staff back into. I think hybrid working is probably here to stay.
Sure.
But even if you have a hybrid working situation, there may be some efficiency, but ultimately you will need a very similar footprint for your staffing.
I'm always interested in the retail thing, because it just feels to me like we're reaping what we've sowed, because as we click on buy now on Amazon and stuff arrives the next day, that is what we are sowing, and the reaping of that is the shops are closing down.
It is,
because we want it delivered in a brown box.
We all do it.
And so we can't have it both.
But again, I think the interesting thing there is what's happened is there's then been a shift away from the retail into sort of larger distribution facility. Sort of the 500,000 square foot Amazon distribution centres that suddenly sort of sprung up and around the country. And I've mentioned Amazon, but there's lots of other companies that have all put in sort of regional distribution centres from where they send out their goods to home.
The little vans for that final mile. Yeah. Well, that's been a real canter through, Jonathan, but thank you for explaining what you do and giving us an idea about the potential pitfalls for the business owner of going into the commercial property market. I'm very grateful for your time. Thanks for joining me on the Business Sense podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Harry.